Okay, everybody. I'm Jay Sexton, Kinder Institute Chair. It is just wonderful to see the turnout that we have for the lecture tonight. You all came out on the right day, and I just want to say, who says that humanities and history is dead in the United States today? This is really, really good to see. Really good to see both the groups of students. We have two groups of students here today. We have a group of students under Professor Stevens that have been studying the Roman Empire. And then we have a group of students that have been subjected to Henry and I for the past semester on global history. But it's also great to see clearly members of the community here today. Please come grab me at some point if I don't know you yet, or grab some of the faculty members here, introduce yourselves, and we want you to know that you are always welcome to come to our events. Today it's a great privilege. It is an honor to introduce Professor A.G. Hopkins, Tony Hopkins, the Emeritus Smuts Professor at the University of Cambridge, also formerly the Walter Prescott Webb Chair at the University of Texas at Austin. It's been great to see Tony the last sort of 24 hours, to be reminded of not just of his intellectual power and distinction, but also his remarkable energy and good spirit. And it's so good to see that in an academic, particularly one who has just survived writing a massive, massive book, and he still has that spring in his step, as you shall see. I'd say two things about our speaker's kind of corpus of work. His academic career has been marked by two traits. The first is its range, its ambition, its remarkable sweep. He is a historian who sees the big picture and identifies the big themes. The second thing is his sort of agenda-setting quality. Everything that he has written has set a new intellectual agenda. It has not closed down debates, rather it has opened up debates, it's revisited old topics, and it's identified new lines of inquiry. The two books of his that I'm most familiar with demonstrate both of these traits. The first, his co-authored book in the 1990s, the Kane and Hopkins thesis. You've probably heard that before, the book on British imperialism since 1688. A remarkable study that identified the financial and commercial drivers behind British imperialism, and indeed not just British imperialism, but the broader processes of global integration. And that brings me to the second book I know of his the best, an edited volume, a collective enterprise with a group of mostly British scholars at Cambridge University, published in 2002, a book I think is underappreciated on this side, Globalization in World History. Published before Americans started thinking about the global turn and globalization and how that affects nations and markets and peoples and ideas. Here we had, in the late 90s and the opening of the last decade, an important study that identified the discrete periods and phases of globalization as it progressed. Now, both of those traits are going to be on display, as you'll see. I'm going to hand it over to our speaker now. Both of those traits will be on display in the new book and in the lecture that he gives today, an ambitious, sweeping, and agenda-setting analysis of the American empire from the mid-18th century to the present day. So let's give a big Missouri welcome to Professor A.G. Hopkins.
Thank you very much. Well, ladies and gentlemen, thank you for turning out in force. Those of you who responded to the small payment that I was able to offer you can collect the sum in a brown envelope as you exit, but not before the end of the lecture, which, as you know, is timed for 3 hours. There's a strange thing about my presentations. I'm always clapped when I start, but it's always followed by a stony silence when I end. There are various theories over the decades as to why this should be. My own interpretation, you might think, is slightly indulgent. It is that the audience is so stunned by the inaccuracies that I've scattered before them, spiced with the most superficial of analyses, that they can think of nothing to do or say but troop out in silence. Now, normally I have the doors locked at these introductory moments, but as I see those who have got the ultra cheap seats, I will have to rest in hope that you will not exit too early from this extraordinarily boring, thoroughly interesting presentation that I'm about to deliver. Well, the first thing I want to say is to thank Jay for his generous introduction, which reminds me of what a wonderful scholar we have missed and you have gained. In fact, it's not always that the elderly defer to the youth, and indeed I regret it myself, but the truth is that I'm here and delighted to be here to meet not only Jay, but some of his colleagues who've had gallantly to listen to me on 2 occasions so far. I'm not quite done yet because we're eating out this evening. But this is especially for me a pilgrimage to see Jay, whom I don't know very well, but who has such a fantastic reputation, not only as a scholar, but also as the most congenial of colleagues. So it's my pleasure to be here on those grounds. And if you ever doubted what a superb catch you have, I hope I'm embarrassing you, I'm doing my best, then doubt it no longer. Now, if I may just put this vodka down by the side. Well, it's the only one that you can't tell on the breath, you know. I can see some of you with red cheeks know that. Now, my father was not a I will start in a minute. I'm just getting the nerves out of me. My father was not a gentleman, but he wanted me to be a gentleman. And he said, one moral I carried with me through life. He said, a gentleman always takes his jacket off before he fights. Now, I wouldn't want you to think I'm in combative mood, but I can sense already that the warm atmosphere in this room is going to get to me. So as long as you're not too scared or ladies too frightened, I will take off my jacket and I'll just pass it if you don't mind putting it somewhere. My wallet's in my pocket, by the way, so yeah. Right, now that's the serious bit done. Let's get on with the fun. What I'm going to do is to offer you a scamper through 3 centuries, which will not only be on thinnest of ice, but will have me underwater from time to time. If I slow my words after 10 minutes or so, it's because not only have I need the vodka by my side, but I've had a bottle of whiskey before I dare present such an overview to scholars who know far more about much of this subject, if not most of it, than I do myself. And I take the certainty of disappointing you with regard to sophistication in the hope of being able to give you a sense of the broad schema that my extraordinarily long book attempts to document rather better than I can do today. So I have tried to offer in my book a synthesis of US international history, not all of it, but not tried to offer you a complete synthesis, a new view of US history in totality. That would be absurd, especially for an outsider like me. So please note, it's international relations. And what I've tried to do is to look at conventional themes and periods from the perspective of an outsider looking in, rather than as an insider looking out. And the net result of all of this is to show, if I'm correct, and my analyst has told me that I have to keep saying that with much conviction, and I'll believe it myself, even if you are persuaded, to show that the United States was part of what I call an imperial system over the last 3 centuries, an imperial system that embraced at least the Western world, and if we had more than the 3 hours I'm allowed, I could perhaps carry that story a bit wider than that. In using the word imperial in this context, I'm not making an ideological judgment. I'm actually drawing attention to a process that is important, whether you love it or loathe it. There are 3 building blocks to my interpretation. The first is the much used but much under-analyzed concept of globalization. And what I've done is to divide globalization into 3 approximate phases. I've given them extremely boring titles for want of inspiration, but you will soon see that what I'm doing is really to put many familiar things in the kaleidoscope, shake it to try and get a slightly different pattern. I don't claim any more than that. And so the first point is that you can, in fact, divide globalization into phases. It wasn't just something that began small and got bigger with various starts and stoppages. And as I said at lunchtime today, it's extraordinary that historians who are now writing about globalization in the titles of their books, dissertations, etc., have not generated, after the years in which this topic has been in vogue, have not generated a profound, extended, useful historiographical debate about whether there are phases of globalization, and if so, how you would demarcate them. The second building block is that the globalization phases move through a dialectical process. That is to say, the success of one phase in expanding, in this case, throws up the forces which have the capacity to alter or even overthrow that phase and give rise to a second one. And the third building block is that during the past 3 centuries, empires were the prime agents of this process, the prime agents of globalization. There are many others, of course. I simply argue that empires were the prime, most important agents of this process. I could stop, if we had more than 3 hours, I could stop further and discuss at boring length the various very important definitions of the terms that I am just taking for granted. I'll just say that the question of what is an empire is, of course, rather crucial to my argument and everybody's argument about whether the United States is an empire today and so on. And the key point in my argument, and I throw this up because I'm generous, I'm throwing something at you so you can pull the rug from under me completely. I don't mind. I'm unemployable. I don't need a reference. All publicity is good publicity, so they say. So my definition of empires, among many other characteristics or qualities, is that they are territorial. The empires of the centuries down to 1950 had a territorial basis because they needed to integrate other societies. And to do that, you had to change institutions, eventually put down railways, change land laws, and so on. So these are territorial entities. The significance of that, for those of you who have not left and are still awake, will come slightly later on. So, phase 1. Now you've got 3 phases to work your way through. Okay, so I'll try and move on to the first phase, which I have called proto-globalization, to describe the complex of European states in the 17th and 18th centuries, which were basically pre-industrial, agricultural based, had an advanced commerce, and they were basically dynastic polities. And these states, according to the early modernists, whose work I have quarried, these states had their prime expression or their most developed expression through the concept of what were called military fiscal states. And the military fiscal states reached a high point, not a terminal point, in the 18th century. Broadly speaking, this was a process of centralization which placed a premium on taxable capacity, either from homegrown peasants or from trade, and it was bound up to some extent, not entirely, with the gunpowder revolution and the need to be able to finance what were then the modern armies, the modern coercive weapons of the state. This was as a set of states in the 18th century which were programmed for war, the century being one of the most warlike of modern times. Efforts have been made to quantify that. Now, I am, of course, making all this up, but as I thought of ways of substantiating these wild thoughts, I came across my old friend Montesquieu. Here is he writing about the arms race in 1748. I'm doing this because by mistake I fell into an archive, which I try to avoid, of course, and into one of these early works. A new distemper has spread itself over Europe, infecting our princes and inducing them to keep up an exorbitant number of troops. It has its redoublings, and of necessity becomes contagious. For as soon as one prince augments his forces, the rest, of course, do the same, so that nothing is gained thereby but the public ruin. Now, that was 1748, before the 7 Years' War amplified the trends that Montesquieu, among others, noticed. And the crisis that came, the fiscal crisis that came in the 1780s, arising ultimately from the fiscal problems of indebtedness brought about by the 7 Years' War, led to a contagion of its own insofar as the fiscal crisis spread among many of the states of Europe, including Great Britain, of course, and it had not only a fiscal component, but as is well known, it encouraged the rise of radical and reformist movements which were criticizing central authority, calling for greater transparency and accountability. If you think of that going on in Europe, and you're thinking perhaps already and more distinctly about build-up of the American Revolution, you have already anticipated one of the many obvious points I'm going to make, which is that what was going on in the mainland colonies in the 1760s, 70s, and 80s was an offshoot of what was happening in Europe, the same basic forces. And the dialectic works because by the late 18th century, the mainland colonies, and here I tell you what you know, the mainland colonies had grown enormously in population. And as we also know through the quantitative work of Geoffrey Williamson and others, the standard of living has risen considerably by the time of the Revolution. In other words, this was not an incentive to revolt, but it gave the mainland colonists the heft, the weight, the power to do something should the imperial state batten onto them in ways that could be presented as being unconstitutional as well as offensive. So what you have there is the sense of Britain's military fiscal state, in this case, reaching the limits of its success. One more quote. I'll have to count some of the others out, otherwise we will be into the 3 hours. Here's Burke in 1774. No contrivance can prevent the effect of distance in weakening government. In large bodies, the circulation of power must be less vigorous at the extremities. So the cost of the 7 Years' War worked its way out in terms of the impositions that you're familiar with on the mainland colonies in the 1760s. What we know about that, thanks to some work of students of Steve Pincus at Yale, we have a much better idea of the political economy of decision-making in London at this time. And we know, to follow my observation about reformist and radical movements, we know of a fierce debate between two schools of thought. One led by Pitt and the reformist Whigs, which said, go easy on the colonies. What we need to do is to develop trade, and we'll get our revenues out of rising trade. And the others, led by Grenville, Lord Bute, and Lord North, who said, no, these are our subjects. We'll go for an extractive empire. In that debate in the early 1760s, you have in microcosm the essential political views which were to surface again in imperial policies throughout the remaining centuries of colonial control. And what we further know, we can connect this up to the short-lived triumph of the extractive school of empire builders, who first of all tried to extract revenues from India. So you see here something of a global dimension to this crisis. And at first it looked as if it was going to succeed, but the very costs of warfare and gathering the revenues for India, which looked so promising, turned sour, and the government had to step in, support the East India Company. There was only one apparently viable source of revenues left, and that was in the mainland colonies. That was a tough nut to crack, which is why it was left till last. So the attempt to shift the burden of taxation in this context is my explanation of one of the main lines of thinking underlying the revolution. That is well known. But here is Tocqueville on revolutions, a man who knew a thing or two about revolutions, being a French aristocrat and having escaped some and observed others. For it is not always when things are going from bad to worse that revolutions break out. On the contrary, a grievance comes to appear intolerable once the possibility of removing it crosses men's minds. And that's why I call the revolution a revolution of declining expectations, because the growth of the colonies had raised expectations which British policies since 1763 had consistently denied and attacked. Now, this may just seem like another story of taxation without representation, because I'm scurrying over this, but I hope if you pause, you'll think that actually, if you set it in terms of this military fiscal state, you have the ability to dig a deeper hole than that. It's not just about the relations of fiscal relations between Britain and the mainland colonies. That's the important link that we focus on. It is about what was going on with a whole category of states with approximate similarities reaching this point of crisis. So, as I said, the US Revolution should be and is being set as in the context of this wider Euro crisis. So we get to 1783, only a couple of centuries to get through. Shifting your chairs for a minute. 1783, and then we have an extraordinary change, a parting of the ways, both understandable and odd. The understandable element of this is that after 1783, certainly by 1812 or 15, the group of historians studying colonial America, they've had enough. They've taken early retirement, or they've gone back to 1607 and they're starting again. Very few historians go on through the 19th century, and why should they? Because there's a new phase then, isn't there? It's the national story. So what happens after 1783 is an understandable focus on internal developments, liberty, democracy, and all the ins and outs, and the second party systems, all that, very important. Now you have that. Do the imperial historians object to what's happening to their territory? Well, they don't, of course, because they've lost it, but they take their resentment out, because if you're an imperial historian, as I am, among other things, you've got your work cut out. You've got to conquer India, you're discovering Australia, you've captured Singapore and the Cape during the French wars, you've got to down Napoleon, there's lots going on. So you have this understandable parting of the ways. So the close relationship that everyone accepts as being significant in the 18th century disappears. Now that's the understandable bit. The bit that is anomalous is that if you look at the period 1783 through to the Civil War from the perspective of somebody who knows about decolonization, the first thing you would think of is distinguishing between formal independence and effective independence. The fact that you take the flag down, put another one up, and have a couple of new names in place doesn't necessarily mean that the continuities of the past have been shed or broken. And so decolonization students of decolonization in the 20th century would look at this from the point of view, what are the elements of continuity which mark the failure or the relatively slow development of the achievement of effective sovereignty? And if you ask that question of the period after 1783, you conceive familiar debates in another way, because you're not just looking at the very important, I must emphasize that, ins and outs of between the Federalists and the Jeffersonian Revolution, etc. So all very important, through to Jackson, Whigs, party system, etc., etc. Can Van Buren keep the North? And all of that's terribly important. But you look at it as another way. You look at these debates as if they are contests about what kind of independence to achieve, what is the best route to doing so. That's the essence, as I see it, of the Hamilton-Jeffersonian positions of this. They both want to achieve independence, but they're trying to do it in different ways. And of course, that view does evolve, and the Jefferson-Jacksonian view, consolidated in the South, settles ultimately for something fairly close to a neo-colonial relationship with Britain. So there you have, as you come through with the rise of slavery and the expansion of cotton exports from the 1820s, there you have a very good example of the continuity of old ties, and in fact their expansion and their further emphasis. So if you look at the politics of the period, that is one way in which I would do it. The key watchwords are not the search for liberty and democracy, important though they were, but the search for viability and development, which you can say you can put into liberty and democracy, or you can say they go alongside or superior to it. But that is how decolonization studies would begin to look at this period. And the economics of this match the politics of it. Did trade expand or decline after 1783? Jeremy Bentham got it right as early as 1793, when he reflected on the debate about the loss of the colonies. He said, people said that our trade was going to decline, it was going to be a disaster. Has it declined? No, it hasn't. It's got bigger and bigger. That was 1793. How much bigger was it still from the 1820s, 30s? And what about British finance? Did that run away? Not for long. In 1803, it was Barings who helped finance the Louisiana Purchase. It was Barings who helped finance the very expansion of the state, was the first foreign bank to finance some of the states as opposed to federal government. Britain's finance expanded considerably too, and some of the consequences of that growing integration with the various panics of the period, 1819, 1837, 39, 1858, can be seen in the internal political ramifications in the United States following that. And my first, finally, by the way, experienced scholars, that is to say elderly scholars who are losing their grip, and I'm a prime example, do allow themselves up to 9 or 10 finalists. I'm going to try and be very careful with you and generous to you, but you can note that one, and I will certainly not get to double figures. That may not be a comfort to you. Finally, on this point, he said, look at the culture of the period. Emerson in 1837 proclaimed in a famous lecture a declaration of literary independence. But like Henry Luce with the American Century in 1941, it was in the future. The significance of his lecture was a recognition that US authors were still highly dependent upon this, what used to be called, was previously called the mother country, for their inspiration. And Whitman, of course, was unfair and unfairly dismissive in calling Whitman a feudal residue. But the point is that, again, decolonization students would look at this period as part of the problem of creating what's called a counterculture, a culture away from that of the imperial power which had been dominant. And here's a fantastic opportunity. If only I was young, I'm prepared to do a Faustian pact. We're pact with the devil to start again and do my career properly. Because where else would you set this period than in the context of expanding settler societies? That is the comparison that needs to be made. And you'll find whether it's Canada, Australia, New Zealand, South Africa, starting later, of course, but going through the same process, they too had a problem of creating a counterculture, because the settlers are more obviously connected to the mother country than other forms of colonization. That is such an obvious comparison. As I say, if I could start again, I would have a successful career because I would see this and, write about it. But there you are, I give it to you. I was going to say for nothing, but let me think about that. A couple of quotes just to show off, so we'll keep it into 2 hours now. Again, in case you think that even with this scamper, this is absurd retrospective imposition on the past, Britain's aim, said Henry Clay in 1820, was to maintain the United States as, quote, independent colonies of England, politically free, commercially slaves. 12 years later, he still remained convinced that the United States was yet to break free from the British colonial system. These smart contemporaries saw this as an ongoing problem of decolonization. Henry Carey, just the same. He thought that if the version of free trade advocated by Adam Smith were to be adopted, it would lead substantially, quote, to the recolonization of these states under the commercial dominion of Great Britain, and so on. Well, the continuing strength then of Anglo-American relations underlines continuity, attempts to resuscitate the disappeared Atlantic complex through the first half of the 19th century. And the events in the United States had parallels elsewhere that are not drawn attention to in any way. First of all, you might be saying to yourself, yeah, but surely the United States was in a special capacity as being one of the first states to decolonize. There's some truth in that. The Latin American republics followed soon after, but the states in Europe were also in a state of decolonization. After the Napoleonic Wars, the Napoleonic Empire had to be unraveled in Germany, Italy, and elsewhere. So the political leaders in those countries were trying to figure out, as the United States politicians were, what kind of a state are we going to build in Europe? Out of that came eventually the United Germany and Italy. But you can think of much of the 19th century in continental Europe as evolving the same sort of struggle as we are familiar with in the United States. And secondly, you can see in Europe a contest after 1815 between the conservative and reformist parties that I referred to in talking about Britain in the 1760s. Victor Hugo was quite clear that the victory at Waterloo in 1815 was a counter-revolution which reinstalled the old dynastic states. So what you have through the first half of the 19th century and going a bit beyond in the case of continental Europe was a contest between the dynasties and the reformist and radical elements, a series of revolutions and so on and so on. What you have in the United States is something very similar as a contest between an increasingly powerful patriarchy and a developing reformist elements. I don't want to exaggerate this contrast. Northerners were not always good guys, I'm aware of that. But from the 1830s onwards, with the anti-slavery movement, with the temperance movements and so on, you can see elements of that going on, as well as the whole contest about how much of a military fiscal state, through Hamilton's institutions and so on, should be installed in the United States. Now, my second phase, take heart, we're moving on, and if I read every other sentence, you could get through in time for a fairly late dinner. Now, my second phase will strike you with the remarkable originality of the title. I'm calling this Modern Globalization, yes, 1850 to 1950. This is the second phase. Now, nobody knows what modern is, really, and it's a very difficult term. But contemporaries, again, were aware that things were changing around this time in the mid-19th century. Baudelaire is said to be the original author of the term modernité, which he defined in a somewhat narrow way. Walt Whitman wrote about it in a very typically spacious Whitmanesque way about what he meant by it. The point is that commentators were aware that various things of great fundamental importance were changing at this time. We know broadly what these changes were. Again, I emphasize that I'm not saying anything tremendously new here, unfortunately, but I am trying to put much of what we're known into a slightly different pattern. So essentially what the modern world meant from 1850, I think, are two things. One is the shift from agriculture to industry, and the second is the shift from dynastic to constitutional states, or nation states with representative governments. And this didn't happen overnight. It was a whole process of uneven development which went on to the First World War and beyond. And the First World War can be put in the context of this second phase. Now, the United States is excluded from this wider story for the reasons I mentioned earlier. It's got its own trajectory. And so you go through the Civil War, you have the Reconstruction period, you then get into the 1890s, populism and so on, get the progressives and stop in 1914, another halting point. We have to have wars because historians wouldn't know when to stop otherwise. And then after 1940, you have another set of historians who take over. And yet the United States, the trends that we identify in the United States are mirror images of those going on in Europe. Look at the 1860s, a really almost, that's an oxymoron, an unprecedented decade in the sense that in the 1860s you have extraordinary political developments. The formation of Germany, the formation of Italy, the reform of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, the reform of France after the defeat at Sedan in 1870, the Meiji Restoration in Japan, even the laggardly soporific British got round to a real Reform Act in 1867, which widened the franchise. My goodness, said a conservative politician, what are we going to do now? And in answer to his question, he said, we must educate our masters. In other words, the franchise was bigger. It posed a huge problem. How do you control these people, give them the sort of education which would encourage them still to defer to their betters? And isn't this what the United States is? Doesn't the United States have its Civil War, 1861 to 65? Wasn't it, among many other things, a uniting the nation and a nation-building process? And what about the other aspect that I mentioned, nation-states and industrialization? Industrialization took off in Britain really in the second quarter of the 19th century. That was an exceptionally early case. For nearly everybody else, it was after 1850. Germany making a big push in the 1870s, United States from that time, and so on, all at different paces as this kind of uneven development that I referred to. But this is when manufacturing generates towns, new wage labor force, a social hierarchy has been thrown in the air. Who is going to rule? On what terms? Can they educate the masters or can they keep them down in some way? How do they appeal to them? These were new questions. And it's no coincidence that this is about the time that some of the great gurus of the day were thinking about this. Mosca, Pareto, Robert Michel with his iron law of oligarchy. These guys were thinking about Europe and the wider universal questions of responsible government and effective control of the polity at exactly this time of upheaval. Moreover, we see quite clearly that increased integration as a result of the expansion of trade brought cyclical fluctuations. Though we have in the late 19th century, if not a Great Depression, I can't go into that, it's been much challenged, but it's been over-criticized, certainly a great deflation, a period of economic difficulty. And that led to urban unemployment, to trade unions, Haymarket riot, Pullman strike, and many other things, including a sheer sense among those controlling the polity or trying to, of the instability among in this case, an immigrant-migrant force which was rootless and could turn to disruptive action, and did so in the 80s and 90s. And this is exactly what was happening throughout continental Europe in the 80s and 90s. And so liberal conservative forces put on their thinking caps. How are they going to cope with this? Now, there are various ways of doing it. At one end, you moved towards an ameliorative form of capitalism, that you can't have all these unemployed. You've got to do something about it, because unemployed people are likely to throw stones and break windows. And if you've got a big house, you've got plenty of windows, and you're going to suffer. I put that a little too subtly for you, but anyway, you get the picture. And this is going on throughout Europe as well as in the United States, as people like Brooks Adams were pondering this and worrying about the degeneration of the race as well. That guy was really pessimistic. And worrying about the flow of energy going somewhere else, the batteries being run down, and wondering how on earth this was all going to be held together. So too in Europe, the elites of the time were pondering exactly the same question, and they came up with a formula which is known in the books in Germany as the alliance of rye and iron, and in France the alliance of wheat and iron, to symbolize the efforts to pull the leaders of agriculture and manufacturing together to hold the polity in a conservative alliance. In the case of France, bringing the church in, overcoming one of the considerable dichotomies in French society between the secular and the spiritual, all in order to try to maintain control in an unprecedented, fast-moving set of changes covering the politics and the economy of these new states. Now, one of these, the solutions, as I mentioned, was a form of amelioration, something akin to, forgive me using this word here, I shall deny it, the welfare state. No, I'm only quoting, I'm not saying I approve for an instant any kind of taxation to help people who are less well off. On the contrary, I'm all for putting the boot in and keeping them down. But those less well informed, but better disposed than I am, thought of these ameliorative measures. So you have Bismarckian welfare reform, you have Giolitti in Italy, you have Lloyd George in Britain, and of course you have the progressives in the United States who were thinking of the same thing and actually borrowing ideas as far away as New Zealand for a more ameliorative social welfare state. So again, there's a difference between achievement and ideas across the board, but the same tendencies can be found and very similar reactions domestically to them. And of course, you find that there is an external proposed solution to this, which is imperialism. The idea of welding the nation in such a way as to overcome these segmented and incipient class divisions and conflicts. And exactly that is what happened. The United States went to war with Spain, as you know, in 1898 and finished up with islands that were inherited from Spain, so to speak, or captured from Spain. Puerto Rico, the Philippines, I've forgotten where else we are. Oh, yes. And then Cuba as a protectorate, and Hawaii, which was not, of course, in the Spanish Empire, and other islands as well. But those are the most important in terms of trade and population. And there is a big argument about this that I'm going to skip over just to tantalize you to ask me a question about it, as to why all this happened. And was it a quest for markets? Was it an aberration? Was it a set of coincidences? Well, you've got to buy several copies of my book to get the full answer. I say several copies because it's so big and heavy, that you will need at least 3 copies in different locations so you don't have to carry it around. No. I'm doing this really to help you because Princeton are already going to issue a disclaimer because, frankly, there have been some indications of lawsuits from people who've tried to lift the book with one hand, and a new illness known as instant carpal tunnel syndrome has been alleged by certain lawyers. I need to say no more, and the costs and damages could be very considerable. One person has already written in talking about personal trauma, breakup of a marriage. You get the picture. So I would suggest, to safeguard my situation but also your health, 3 copies is a minimum, all right? So we can look at imperialism of the late 19th century as a form of enforced or compulsory globalization. We don't normally see it that way. But if you think about it, in the last 20 years of the 19th century were a period when the rest of the world, so to speak, if it hadn't already been conquered, as India had been and a few other places, but everywhere else was more or less mopped up. China, of course, and Latin America remained independent, but China can be thought of as a semi-colony, and there's a big argument that, in fact, Latin American republics were very much under the influence of the large foreign powers. By 1914, even the penguins of Antarctica had been brought under international supervision. And believe me, they were the most recalcitrant of colonial subjects. And the United States then participated in this process at exactly the same time. And as I say, I will not give you the explanation that I have for it, but it's something that we could take up if you're interested. The key point, I think, is that by 1900, certainly by 1914, the United States had indeed achieved effective independence. If you look across the board at the politics, at the economics, the US manufacturers were penetrating British and other European markets, causing much disquiet in the factories of Manchester and elsewhere. The Wall Street was cooperating on a basis of equality with the City of London, and US culture high culture anyway, had achieved its independence through the work, as we all know, of Mark Twain, Walt Whitman, Emily Dickinson. These are vernacular voices speaking in a way that the early writers could not. What an Australian called in 1950, when Australians were still, after all that time, Australians were still debating their own cultural independence. He had the magical phrase, which led to a huge debate, cultural cringe, he said. And he used that phrase to refer to Australians in 1950. He said, you're still cringing and deferring to the British. Well, of course, Americans cringe to nobody, but there was a sense of deference that had gone by that time. William Stead, the well-known British noted commentator in 1904, observed, the old, almost pathetic humility with which American writers listened to the criticisms of Europe has disappeared. And that's the time when the celebrations, the anthem, the flag, displayed in public schools, veterans associations, others in the 1890s, all come to the fore. And this is my very last quote, and I will shorten it for you. In 1901, speaking at the 125th anniversary of the Battle of Trenton, Woodrow Wilson said, no war ever transformed us quite as the war with Spain transformed us. No previous years in it, so it runs on. We've witnessed a new revolution, the transformation of America completed, this little group of states, and so on and so on. And he concludes, that little confederation has now massed and organized its energies. A confederation is transformed into a nation. And I'll ask you a rhetorical question, which you can answer in private afterwards so as not to humiliate me, and it's this. At what point before 1898 might that statement have been made with credibility? That little confederation has now massed and organized its energies. A confederation is transformed into a nation. I go to my second failure, and I think I can probably manage 3 finalies altogether, so it's not too bad. No answer to that, I understand. So after 1898, we come to another extraordinary non-episode in US history. The most extraordinary gap in the whole history of Western imperialism. I go for gross exaggerations as a desperate attempt to hold attention. So I will back down from that, but you'll have to push me very hard. The Insular Empire, acquired in 1898 and dissolved after World War II, remained under US rule for half a century, much the same as the other European empires which acquired or expanded their empire in the 1880s and 90s. And the oddity is that after all the books which are written about the War of 1898, you know the ones, the 500-page jobs about whether McKinley prayed on 1 knee or 2 knees before deciding to go to war, all these really important books, smaller than my own. Once those have dealt with the war, everyone goes away. The last book on the management, the rule of this insular empire was published in 1962 by an American historian in Leiden, the Netherlands, and promptly forgotten. And it's actually an excellent book, and I hope in my citations to have done justice to him and a host of others whose work perhaps has not been as fully recognized as I think it should be. So if we have to, this is a completely different problem. If you're going from 1783, or indeed from 1607 to 1914, masses of work. If you start to look at the Insular Empire, you're in a different world altogether. Wonderful work has been done in recent years, but it's on individual islands. And very little has been done to take an overview. So what I've done here in 3 chapters, whatever it is very preliminary, and I'm sure it will be improved upon before long. But there is a fascinating, I know to use the word fascinating at this stage in my talk is perhaps stretching more than a point, but I like to believe my own propaganda, so let me say that louder. Yes, there is a fascinating aspect to this story, because you might think that these islands are very small places and of no consequence, and the relativities certainly indicate the United States mainland was huge and these islands were small. Nevertheless, in 1940, the islands I've enumerated had about 25 million people. That's quite a lot of people. And more significantly, from the point of understanding history, they were a microcosm of the larger, I should say, British and French empires. So everything we know about how to approach and analyze those empires is found in these diverse islands. So there were colonies of settlement, white settlement, Hawaii. There were colonies of concessions or plantations, Cuba, and to a degree Puerto Rico. There were colonies of what are known in the books as peasant or household farming, largely Philippines. All the techniques of rule, direct rule, indirect rule, strategies of assimilation and association that are so familiar to everybody working on the Western empires are all present there. And the standard exchanges, raw materials, particularly sugar, in exchange for manufactures, the ties then between the center and the so-called peripheries, all of that is reproduced. And of course, the same ideology of a civilizing mission backed by the notion of a racial and technological supremacy, just the same as the British and French thought about themselves. And a final feature of commonality, they follow the same trajectory. So roughly speaking, from 1900 to 1914, the difficulties of the 80s and 90s had been overcome. The international economy recovered. It was easier at that point, within limits, to begin to establish some sense of colonial rule. Then the system was shaken by difficulties during the First World War. The 1920s were spent by the United States and by Britain and France in reasserting their power. The 1930s, again, a period of great shock and economic distress, which translated into political movements. Were the US islands quiescent and away from all those pressures? Not at all. The commissioner of police was shot in Puerto Rico, massive riots everywhere. Just the same story of a discontent across the globe arising from the integrative processes that I've talked about. So you can see, I think, from this hasty commentary that the United States imperial experience, as I have described territorial empires, has every reason to be included in US history and also in the histories of Western empires, and it's in neither of them. My third and final, note it, 3, I won't give you another final, period is what I've called post-colonial globalization, not post-imperial, post-colonial, because you could still have a form of imperialism. You can have imperialism without empire, so I'm calling it post-colonial, from 1950 to the present day. After this time, and this is the world that we are living in now, the beginnings of the emergence of our own world came into being after the Second World War. A transformative shift in the character of globalization. World opinion, that difficult concept that slips through the fingers, but nevertheless, despite its intangibility, has profound material consequences. World opinion altered. There was a challenge to concepts of racial supremacy. Civil rights were topped by concepts of human rights. Civil rights relate to the right to vote. Essentially, human rights involve rights to welfare, rights to education, and so on. These ideas came to the fore. Moreover, this assault on the concept of racial supremacy was supported eventually by new institutions, the United Nations, if I may use that word here. Is that all right? The United Nations, I know it's not popular in the United States. The United Nations and its various affiliates, these were permanent institutions not designed, it was actually they were designed to give voice to the victors of the war, but they gradually changed their tone as more and more colonial states became independent and joined the United Nations. They became, in turn, in the 1950s, a spokespeople for the new morality that I have alluded to. There's a massive change in the nature of economic integration. Instead of raw materials and manufacturers going from one center to the peripheries, you had the development of inter-industry trade, whereby the advanced countries of the world, United States, Europe, Japan, and now China, traded with one another. Just think about it. These countries are not the objects, realistically, of imperial advance or colonial control. It's not feasible and it's not necessary. So the changing nature of economic integration had a profound effect on the need for empire. And as this was happening more recently, of course, manufacturing began to shift, especially to Asia, which now accounts for something like 25% of world trade in manufacturers. This is a historic shift, which again runs counter to the old style connections. And as this was happening, the ties of connection became more regional, without necessarily a center to them. The European community, the ties, NAFTA, the ties between New Zealand and Japan and China, Australia, Japan and China, severing the old imperial links. And the last of these important changes is what imperial historians refer to as the Green Uprising. Not the Green Revolution, that's wheat and India. The Green Uprising is the shift from elite constitutional nationalism in towns, the kind of responsible opposition to colonialism, to a more mass organization which reached out. A green uprising reached into the countryside to pull the peasantry into the new organizations. Gandhi did it in India in the First World War. Intimations of this were present in the 1930s, but it became particularly pronounced after World War II with improved communications, whether motor transport, radio, etc., etc. So the nationalist, colonial nationalism took on a new dimension. Jackson was the forerunner of Gandhi, if you like, because he contrasts Adams and Jackson, and you have a contrast between the founders of the Indian National Congress in 1884 and the rise of Gandhi during the First World War. This again is a major shift which posed a huge challenge to the colonial order. And it was out of that you got the decolonization process, which took place in various stages that I won't go into, but was complete essentially by about 1960. And when I hear you ask, you're sotto voce, but I've got the questions you're asking, how did that fit with the United States? I'm very glad you asked that question, because Philippines got independence in 1946. Puerto Rico became and had an ambiguous title of Commonwealth in 1952, I think it was. Hawaii became incorporated as a state in 1959, and Cuba, which will never be forgiven, did what the founding fathers did in throwing off the yoke of colonialism in 1776 and seeing it through in 1783. The sins of the fathers will be vested not just upon the children, but in perpetuity. And this timing fits exactly with the decolonization process of the rest of the European world. And I put it to you that this cannot be a set of coincidences. It stems basically from the same fundamental processes of change. And so I leave you with a final puzzle. It's after 1945, when the United States has shed its territorial empire, and as the other powers have too, that everyone starts talking about the United States being an empire. And in my view, the United States is, of course, a hugely significant power. That's not in question. But the nature of its demands on the world, the nature of its relationships with the rest of the world are very different from those of the great empires that I have described to you. It has 1 trillion bases. Books have been written about it. We know that every new book counts another base and the numbers go up. It's a bit like counting the slave trade, actually. So loads of bases, but these are enclaves. They're not designed to integrate the countries in which they are placed. They are designed basically for geostrategic purposes. And so I much prefer to call the United States by another name, because if you call it an empire, you legitimate comparisons so that you have books written like, "Are we the new Rome?" Well, the answer is no. But it seems to legitimate that inquiry and so on. So don't confuse the fact, there is a danger of some people confusing great power status and simply calling it an empire without recognizing the implications of allowing or validating what I think to be false comparisons. We can, as I'm sure you'll wish to discuss that. Yet even hegemons have their limits. And I argue in the book that the power of the United States during 1945 onwards has actually been more limited than is often claimed. I say this not in any way to put the United States down, but as a counter to the kind of present-mindedness. When the citizens of a great power write their own history in their own time, they're very inclined, the British do the same, they're very inclined to exaggerate both themselves, their era, and the role of their state in the world, because they never see things from the point of view of the recipients, and they exaggerate themselves. Problems in the world can be formulated as, why don't those people agree with us? So we have to be very careful about that, and my chapter 15, or is it 150, I forget too, actually attempts to put in some qualifications. And I conclude, hegemons, unfortunately, are reluctant to abandon their illusions. Aspirations become more precious as the prospect of attaining them recedes. In these matters, as in so many others since the 18th century, the United States and the United Kingdom continue to move in complementary fashion. Making America great again is echoed in Brexit. Yet the age of great empires has passed, which shows that nostalgia for hegemony is in reality evidence of the hegemony of nostalgia. Thank you.
There's going to be a reception outside. There's going to be the opportunity to buy 3 copies of the book. Each will be for sale. But if our speaker can bear it, I'd like very much to have some questions. Henry has the microphone and will distribute when the hands are raised. The tradition here is that students ask the first question. And then we open the floor more generally. So I'm looking for student hands. Kate.
Hi. So we read your chapter in Prospective Global History, and you talked a lot about how in the early 20th century, the U.S. became really almost indifferent toward their colonies and really didn't want to have to deal with them because of the large partisanship then with that issue. Was the same thing exhibited then in Britain and France with their colonies at the same time?
Could everyone hear that question with the microphone functioning? That's excellent, because often they have such a boom. I'm very good. I think it's an excellent question, and it enables me to touch upon one of the very many things that I have omitted, so thank you for that. I talked about the similarities between the British and the US empires, and I omitted to talk about some of the differences. I think there are 2 very big differences, one of which at least needs to be explored. And the first difference is the US is unique, I think, in inheriting a large part of its empire from another colonial power. And so that's Spain. So there's a whole question of how far the legacy of Spain influenced American rule and how far the US was attempting to push aside what it thought to be the old medieval influence of Spain. And actually, the little indications we have of this is that the early administrators had the view that Spain was a declining, woebegone power, and they'd sweep it all clear. And then by the 1930s, they'd come to have a much greater respect for what the Spanish had done, and were actually following in their footsteps in many ways. So that's a great theme, and is one really open for research. The second matter has been discussed a little bit more, but as I said, this whole colonial period in the US needs further research, that banal phrase that historians use to keep themselves in employment. And that is that Britain and France had their anti-imperial movements, so very powerful ones on the left particularly, but nevertheless, when push came to shove, they managed to achieve, both of them, remember, one's a monarchy, one's a republic, it's the French connection that is the real point of parallel with the United States, and that's not been looked at all. But when push came to shove, there was a bipartisan policy. The empire was thought to be so important to the national interest that although you could oppose it and sort of criticize it, you weren't actually going to dismantle it unless you had to. It was in the British national interest to do so. In the case of the United States, the colonial project was blighted by a lack of bipartisan policy because the Democrats had poked a stick at the Republicans in the 1890s and said, you've got to liberate Cuba from medieval Spain and so on. And the Republicans sort of tried to fend this off. And eventually McKinley, whether on one knee or two, having prayed, decided to go to war with Spain, initially to unite in the immediate cause, to unite the Republican Party. And then, of course, Bryan and the Democrats were dished in the 1900 election. Thereafter, the Democrats took the view of using the possession of empire as a kind of electoral coupon, which they could use against the Republicans. And indeed, the Republicans themselves shouldered the burden of empire with increasing reluctance. Roosevelt himself, around 1907, something like that, said, He was responsible. He said, I wish we hadn't got the Philippines. It was supposed to be an outer defense, and it was really just a liability, you see. So the enthusiasm for this empire, there were no gold there were no oil, there were no markets there. These were war-torn places of great poverty. They were problems rather than solutions, though they solved a short-term problem of the critical 1890s. So that lack of bipartisanship ran through the colonial period. And of course, if you wanted to go into colonial service, this was a great blockage, because you didn't know if the Democrats, if they came to power, would actually take the whole thing apart. So, and there was no colonial office, so it was a pretty haphazard operation. Shortage of funds was critical. Even in the Pacific, the build-up in the late 1930s, there was very little done to prepare the Pacific Islands for what actually happened in 1941.
Thank you.
Good question, thank you.
Good questions.
Thank you. First of all, I just want to say thank you for your talk. A lot of information there, enjoyed it. And with regards to suggesting that the U.S. is no longer an empire, I wanted to ask if you're familiar with the book. Apologies. I had it written down.
Go for it, don't matter, it doesn't matter. I don't have senior moments, I have senior weekends, so.
I'm not that old. The Confessions of an Economic Hitman. If you're familiar with that book.
Well, I think I'm going to repeat myself here. You have, I hope I didn't say this at one, but as I have a senior moment, I probably did. Yes, when confronted by an omission from his dictionary, Dr. Johnson confronted the person who criticized him, and when she finished telling him off for not inserting a word in his dictionary that she thought should be there, he gave the explanation. He said, "Ignorance, madam, sheer ignorance." And so I have not heard of that word, that book. So perhaps if you can give me a one-sentence summary, I will pronounce judgment on it.
Wonderful.
The entitlement of seniority. Yeah.
So the author, he was an economist for a large United States corporation, and he purports that he was sent abroad to make projections for infrastructure projects in developing countries that would inflate their economic benefit, so that these developing countries would take loans from the IMF and the World Bank and the U.S. And when inevitably the projects did not create the stimulus that he suggested, then the U.S. would come after them, would demand that we were able to install bases in their countries or to extract resources. And then if they didn't cooperate, that's when we'd send in the CIA.
Okay, so yes, I haven't read that book. It's all very familiar, actually. So when was it published? Can you remember?
I don't know off the top of my head. I would say in the past 15 years.
Okay. No, I don't know that book, but of course the theme is pretty familiar to all of us. This is a theme that can be treated in a very crude manner. The best book I know on the financial relationships between the US and some of its quasi-dependent territories is by Noel Moorer, who published a book, the title which I have forgotten just a couple of years ago, and is a very skilled, authoritative exploration of the way in which companies worked with the United States, mainly to bail out the companies which were supposedly there for responding to market incentives and to make money. And when they failed to do so, they were indeed presented themselves as being too big to fail and pulled the US government in. The other points you make about bringing the CIA in and capturing resources and so on strike me as being just a bit too, to misuse the term, Machiavellian. Most of these countries didn't have resources. And if they had anything very valuable like oil, that had to be more of a negotiated agreement. Certainly the CIA is everywhere, but, the CIA's interventions were only successful in the narrowest definition of the word success. You take the Latin American coup d'etat, which have been supported by the United States. And what happened there is you get, in the words of Chalmers Johnson, blowback. You create, in the period after 1945, you have an awareness of nationalist aspirations, of the validation of those aspirations, rightly or wrongly, against a scale of human rights and so on and so on. And so you can organize a coup d'etat, but you can't orchestrate the ultimate outcome. The Alliance for Progress could have collapsed in 1971. How successful has the United States been in the Middle East and in Africa? Defeat, the Korean War was at best a draw, defeat in Vietnam, defeat in Angola, Somalia. You see, there's a difference between having all this power and its effectiveness in the context of the present day world. So I'm straying a little bit from your question. All I would say, with proper deference to your author, I haven't read the book, but the broad theme is familiar to me, and I would just caution about going along with the whole of that story, which may well apply in certain cases, but as a blanket understanding, it strikes me as being a formula being applied to the world, possibly without fully integrating the diversities of the global order.
So I am curious as to what unique role, if any, you see the subjugation of the Native Americans in American history playing into these dialectical processes. How did that, if at all, bring about this transition between types of globalization?
Yeah, well, for top of the head, I don't see that working as a dialectic, because in some ways it is itself the product of an anterior and greater dialectic, which is, of course, the very expansion of the US, which is made possible through the changes that I identified in the late 18th century. Political changes. The British wished to hold the proclamation line. What was the first thing that happened with independence? Whoa, the galloping west began. And then you have a story that is fairly familiar to you, but it stems from these other processes, and you know better than I do, it gathers pace in the 19th century because of the growth of technological skills from railways to the improved means of coercion through repeater rifles and so on and so on. And of course, barbed wire. And that other great technological invention of the United States, lawyers. So you put all those things together, barbed wire and the law kind of was how the West was won.
So I'm in Professor Sexton's global history class, and the main text that we've been working with is Darwin's After Tamerlane.
Yeah.
In it, he characterizes the United States and the Soviet Union after the Second World War, both as constituting kind of new forms of empire.
Yeah.
I'm curious if you agree with his characterization of the Soviet Union as an empire with its kind of control over puppet governments in Eastern Europe.
Yeah.
And then if so, if some of the excursions in like Eastern Ukraine and in the Crimea in the past decade or so could also kind of fall under this characterization of like a reclamation of this old era of kind of like imperial dominance, this kind of, nostalgia that the UK and the US have engaged in.
Okay, well, I'm not an expert on this subject, which means I will speak about it with great confidence. Okay, there is an immediate point of comparison which Westad has made in his book on the Cold War, which strikes me as being applicable across a wider period of time. And it's often thought that the US is an empire because of its expansion westwards and the absorption of Native Americans and so on. And then Russia was a territorial empire moving eastward and similar. But of course, there are great differences. In the case of the United States, I would argue that you can have imperialism without the ultimate result being an empire. The basic reason, there are transitions, I agree, but The basic reason being that the states that were eventually created were on a basis of constitutional equality with one another. Whereas in the case of the Russian Empire, that was not always wasn't the case, because you had an autocratic center and you did have semi-autonomy of some ethnic groups in the eastward part of the United States, but others were under the control of people who were called viceroys and provincial governors. And of course, there was another major difference, and that is in the ratio of population, because there weren't many Native Americans. They were diminishing as the 19th century advanced, and there were an increasing number of settlers. Whereas in the case of Russia, the settlers moving west were in small numbers until 1905, when they did expand considerably. Even so, and that the numbers are not properly known, they're moving into a vast area where ethnic groups could be said to number as much as 20 million. So you have to take in mind these differences in the ratio between rulers and ruled. Now, I don't really want to go beyond the 1945 period. I could warble on about it, but I don't have much authority on that. I could talk about it, but I think in deference to your excellent question, I won't. It may be that we have somebody here of great authority on this. I just read the newspapers about these matters, and who could comment on it, if not at this moment, subsequently.
There's time for a couple more questions. Hunter has had her hand up.
So mine is also kind of on those lines. So you said that influence is not empire in your text, and you also said that the age of great empires has passed. And I just want to know your response to this argument, that what if the U.S. is acting as an empire, and that, like, the U.S. assumed that Iraq had limited sovereignty, and that, you know, we should violate that when we see fit. And maybe when you're speaking about territory and empires, what if instead of just annexing the territory, you know, we're, I guess, growing our networks, and so maybe that's a different variation of our territorial empire today?
Yeah.
And modern empire?
Yes. Okay, thank you. Very good question. I'm getting 2 points out of it, rightly or wrongly. The first point is that the invasion of Iraq in 2003 aroused such interest and produced so many books and commentaries precisely because it looked as if it was an old-style bid for territorial acquisition with a view to rapid and far-reaching institutional change, which is what the empires I'm discussing are doing. And part of the outrage against that was that you couldn't do it. But the other part of the outrage was it was quite inapplicable in the circumstances of the early 21st century. The second aspect of it is, yes, let's say the great powers, or in this case, the great power of today, exercises its influence in ways which are not entirely dissimilar from those of the British, who also used the power of communication, of symbolism, the ideology of their own superiority. I mean, the cheapest way of colonial rule is to persuade other people of their inferiority. And if you do this, you don't have to, use the baton so often. But you see, the difficulty is when you get a great power which has virtually no territorial penetration of the kind I've described, but you recognize these other ways, the bases, the communication, the economic transnationals, and so on, you immediately do exactly what you've done, which is to say, well, can't we call it an empire of another kind? And there are famous historians who've said that, actually. But what does that mean? You want to hang on to the term, but at the same time, you're opening up by saying it's of another kind. So what do I have to do with that? Am I to say, well, that's fine, and we compare it to Rome because it's an empire, but it's of another kind? It's having your cake and eating it. I think it simply draws attention to the problem of classification of what is a novelty. And of course, the problem then is that you need two to make a comparison. And if the situation of the United States is sufficiently unique in these matters, in terms of scale, if not always in terms of the ingredients of power, then you don't have a point of comparison.
I suspect that your long historical view means that the last year's development in American politics frightens you less than it does me. But are you frightened at all?
Well, I think we have more, I'm speaking on behalf of the rest of the world, you understand. We have more reason to be frightened than you do, because in domestic policies, I was going to say that we are used to thinking that there are sufficient checks and balances, whereas in foreign policy, of course, the president does have more leeway. So we should shiver, some of us, rather more than you, I think. But since the nationalist agenda appears to involve some kind of pullback, then perhaps we may escape. I say perhaps because if President Trump does cut the funding for US forces in Europe, that'll save something, but it will also reduce US influence. Whereas if he gets involved in a trade war, which he seems to with China, the consequences of that could have both domestic as well as foreign policy implications. Yeah. I think the moral of my book, insofar as I've pointed it, the last section, it appears in all 3 copies you're going to buy, by the way, is called Captain America Rides Again. And it is an attempt to kind of frame where we are without falling into the trap of predicting the future. And I do quote Dante's Inferno on the penultimate page or so, because in there, somewhere in the 9th circle and the 8th chasm, or whatever it is, there is a special place for augurers, prophets, and soothsayers, who shall be condemned to walk backwards with their heads twisted round in perpetuity for their effrontery in trying to foresee a future which is unforeseeable. So I've stopped at trying to make predictions because the record of predictions, even by highly paid social scientists, is abysmal. Just let me finish. So what I am saying on this is that history can be used in a way that we can understand the parameters of future decision making and the probabilities of the path of the future, but it's not specific enough to give the soundbite that policy needs.
So if you buy a 4th copy, I'm told that he might give a proper
well, I'll go.
What a wonderful paper, what wonderful energy. Let's thank Tony Hopkins.